Greetings to our brave and courageous colleagues in the water world. We're delighted to join you today with a very important webinar that will be giving you some good experience and field work and hard won on how utilities are responding to this unprecedented coronavirus pandemic. I'm really delighted to be joined today by three stars from the industry. First is Andy Kricun, and each one will introduce themselves in a moment, but he just retired after 34 years at the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority. Next is Bruce Husselbee. He was the chief engineer at the Hampton Roads District, which is fascinating in its size and scale. And third, and batting cleanup, is Todd Swingle, who's the executive director of the Toho Water Authority. Our goal today is really to engage in a conversation with this group about what utilities are doing in response to the coronavirus. We know that many of you out there are adopting many of the strategies we'll have discussed, but if we raise even one idea that could trigger some action in addition to what you're doing, we will consider this a success. And certainly just the flavor and angle and perspective of what's working and what's not, lessons that have learned, because we know that there are many weeks and perhaps months and even longer to come in our response to the virus. So I wanted to first give each panelist a chance to summarize their background. They're really an impressive group, and tell you a little bit about where they work. I will ask Andy. He just retired, as I mentioned, after 34 years at the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority. But just to give a sense of where he was up through January 31st, and then what he's doing today. But a little bit about yourself and then your utility, and then we'll get to the task at hand. Let me turn it over to Andy.
Thanks very much, George. Well, it's certainly a pleasure and an honor to be on this panel with you and Bruce and Todd, and thanks to WEF for inviting us, especially on this important issue. And I echo what you said about honoring the brave men and women who are leading our water sector. They do it every day under normal circumstances, protecting the public health and protecting the waterways of our country. But even in this crisis, and even at the risk of personal health, they're still doing it. And so I hope that, as you said, George, we can offer some suggestions that might be helpful. As you said, George, I worked with the Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority for 34 years. It's an 80 million gallon per day wastewater treatment plant located in Camden, New Jersey, right across the Delaware River from the city of Philadelphia. And we service 500,000 people. I retired there on February 1st, and now I'm really lucky to be working with you, George, at Moonshot Missions, a nonprofit that helps water utilities, especially those that service underserved communities. And I'm also working as a senior fellow with the U.S. Water Alliance.
Thank you, Andy. And just to embellish what he just described, Andy, over his 20 plus years, he was both chief engineer and CEO of Camden County, improved the performance of that utility in almost every respect and reduced rates. So quite a story that Andy has. Bruce, tell us about yourself and Hampton Roads.
Thanks, George. The Hampton Roads Sanitation District, or HRSD, is a public sector organization that handles the conveyance and treatment of wastewater in southeastern Virginia. We serve 18 cities and counties over a very large service area. We have about 850 employees. Our area is larger than the state of Delaware, and it takes over 2 hours to drive from end to end in our service area. So it's quite a large area, which creates many challenges for us, but actually creates some opportunities too when we look at the challenge we're facing right now. So my role as the Director of Engineering, I'm responsible for the planning, design, and construction of HRSD's capital improvement program. It's a very large effort, about $2.8 billion over the next 10 years. My department's also responsible for overseeing HRSD's asset management program and all of our real estate matters. We have I'm really proud of our folks who work at HRSD. We have a highly engaged and motivated workforce, and they're incredibly flexible and very motivated to take on the challenges that we're facing at the moment.
Fantastic, Bruce. And I've worked with Hampton Roads Sanitation District for many years. They're close to us when I was at DC Water. And the level of ingenuity and innovation coming out of Hampton Roads is really breathtaking, and often leads not just the state, but the country and the world. So quite an outfit. Todd, I'm fascinated by your background at the Toho Water Authority down there in Kissimmee in Florida. And your deep history in environmental engineering and all the rest. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the Toho Water Authority?
Yes, thank you. My name's Todd Swingle. I'm the Executive Director for the Toho Water Authority. We are a regional authority that was formed by special act of the state legislature. So we're a full service organization that serves over 100,000 connections. So a service population of a little over 300,000 here in Central Florida. We're located in Osceola County, just south of Orlando. And as we talk through the response today, one of the interesting things that we'll have is that our service population is certainly very varied, with much residential service population, but also heavily influenced by the tourist activities and tourist corridors within the Central Florida area. We are a full service provider of water, wastewater, and reclaimed water services. And so that's a pretty complete end-to-end responsibility for those utility services. My personal background, I've started as an engineer by training and worked in the consulting field and for another small municipality, but also had the opportunity to spend a few years with an industrial manufacturer and looking at global water issues. So in doing that and spending time on the other side of the world, you certainly recognize how critical water is to daily living, and it's something that we're seeing and clearly why we're here talking today about how critical the services we provide are, not only every day, but especially in a response like this.
Fantastic, Todd. And I have to say, I was reviewing materials in preparation for this program, and I think the documents that I saw from Todd that Toho put out to its personnel on the current crisis were perhaps the best I've ever seen. So as an exhibit for what you do generally, it was really impressive. And I also want to highlight that what a common feature to Andy, Bruce, and Todd is that they, during their careers, have volunteered their time to better the industry at all sorts of ways, and principally in supporting WEF. And I want to echo what Andy said. We're delighted that WEF is hosting this webinar. I don't think there's an enterprise that engages with the people who are doing this work in the field courageously at all times, but particularly now, better than WEF does. And WEF would not be the organization it is without the efforts of the folks who volunteer. And I just want to express my appreciation to Andy, Bruce, and Todd for their efforts on that front. But let's get to the task at hand, which is really going through some examples and field work experiences and lessons learned about how utilities are responding to this pandemic. Andy, maybe I'll start with you. One thing that Moonshot does is try to, we don't create lots of new information because we're looking at what's being done across the industry, but we do like to try to make it easy for utilities that are hard pressed at the moment to gain perspective. And we released a compendium of ideas we received. And Andy was a principal author of that. Andy, can you give us a quick overview of the kinds of things that you see utilities doing and that you would be doing at Camden County in response to a challenge of this unprecedented scale?
Absolutely, George. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think that at Moonshot, we sort of see ourselves as the bees that are pollinating and bring good ideas, perhaps that we ourselves may have had from our time at DC Water and in Camden County, but also other of our colleagues in the water industry, and try to disseminate that information as broadly and deeply as possible, especially to non-network utilities that may not have the access to information in the same way that the more networked and resource utilities have. So I think the most important thing, as we know, is that the challenge for water utilities, and you're going to hear a lot about it from Bruce and Todd and their outstanding utilities. But I think that the key thing is to keep the staff safe. I mean, we've heard a lot about flattening the curve, nationwide and worldwide. Well, the same is true with every individual water utility. We have a limited number of mission-critical employees, and we have to make sure that we preserve their health first in and of itself, but also because we need them to operate and maintain the vital services that the water sector provides to provide safe drinking water and protect the waterways. So I think that the key thing has been to keep the employees safe. So non-mission critical employees have been working from home remotely. That the mission critical employees have been spread out a bit more. So for example, working on weekend shifts, or the normal weekend shift, which would be more of a skeleton staff, is being preserved more throughout the week so that you're spreading people out, keeping them away from each other. Ordinarily, you would have maybe people go out to check a manhole, 2 or 3 people in a team. Now they're taking separate cars. So the idea is to really replicate or adapt social distancing and flatten the curve with the personnel. And again, you'll hear more about that from Bruce and Todd, but I think that's really essential to keep the personnel safe. Also, obviously, no interactions with the public, having remote public meetings, making sure that the public doesn't come in for, to pay bills, that sort of thing. So I think that's the most critical thing. Also, making sure that critical supply chains remain intact, as far as chemicals and other equipment coming in. Also, disposal chains like sludge disposal going out, making sure that they remain intact as the personnel may be impacted. And then, also having an emergency list at hand is important. The other thing I think is trying to use remote sensing where possible. Enunciators at pumping stations and at treatment plants, having some operators, view in remotely, like with, say if there's people either FaceTiming and to operators that are at home, or actually having cameras in control centers so that they can see from home, and again, maintaining that social distancing and flatten the curve for the employees. And then, of course, the utilities are already thinking ahead to the impact on their customers, and across the country, water utilities are putting a hold on and a moratorium on shutoffs, and even in many cases actually reconnecting people who had been shut off recently in order to minimize the impact on low-income households. Sewer utilities are considering waiving late fees and putting a moratorium on those sorts of things as well. In the long term, we'll talk about that later. Once we get past the virus, we're obviously going to have to think about the economic impacts of this. But for right now, the water utilities have been focusing on keeping their employees safe, keeping the public safe, and minimizing the immediate economic impact while continuing to optimize operations. And I think from what I'm hearing, people have just done incredible jobs above and beyond what they do on an everyday basis.
Thank you for that, Andy. And what I like best about that summary is it accentuates what I know we'll hear from Bruce and Todd as well, which is the traits that we all love and value about our colleagues in the water industry have really come to the forefront in this crisis, and taking the steps necessary to make sure that people have access to water, which will have economic challenges to the utility over the longer term, but in the short run, no cutoffs, connecting back, plans to make payments easier. I mean, all of these steps are to make sure that people have what they need in a crisis. And that's really the industry stepping up, as well as protecting its own employees and doing this critical work. So let me switch it over and let's hear from folks running utilities now doing this work. And Andy, I welcome at any time if you want to jump in and offer commentary on what you hear. I would be delighted. I know you have tremendous perspective. But let me ask you, I'll start with Bruce, just how's your team doing? Any positive coronavirus, COVID employees, or the demeanor of the staff? How are things going with you, Bruce?
A great question. So we've been very fortunate in our area with relatively few COVID-19 cases, and we've not had any employees yet that have tested positive. So feeling very fortunate, but we're definitely not taking this for granted. We have our business continuity plan in place. We're very familiar with dealing with hurricanes and planning for hurricanes, as I know Todd is too down in Florida. But this pandemic virus is something new, so we're really having an opportunity here to really put some processes in place before we get hit hard. So, a few things we've been doing. We've been following all the CDC best practices. We've got our folks who need to be at work. We've been using Skype, Zoom, and Microsoft Teams very efficiently and effectively, particularly in the engineering department. One of the things I said before, we're a very remote organization, so we got 16 different wastewater treatment plants in a very large service area. So we've had to get very good at working remotely. And we've done a good job in recent years of automating all of our business processes. We've got an electronic bidding process. We communicate well remotely with our own staff, our consultants and contractors, and we've been experimenting with teleworking at a pretty good pace here. So we have about 45 employees in our engineering department, and all but 2 admin folks are working from home. So we were about a week ago, we got everybody working from home, and for the last week, it's been going quite well. So we're working effectively with our staff, with our consultants, with our contractors, with a number of our vendors and suppliers, and generally it's been a very effective process. And the fact that we've been working on this for a number of years, not really because of a pandemic concern, but just to be as efficient and as effective as we could be, has really reaped some benefits here as we've gotten into this challenge.
Thank you, Bruce. That's impressive to hear. I read through the materials you sent me in advance, and it was great reading. It was uplifting to know how prepared both of these utilities were before this happened. And it may well be because here your utility is right at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and therefore very at risk of storms. And of course, Todd down in Toho is right in Florida in prime hurricane area. So you both, out of necessity, have had to be prepared for outages, challenges, people getting to work if there's a major storm. And as a result, when this came, you were better ready. I'm going to definitely come back to you and learn more and hear more about what you've described. I'm fascinated by, given that you have this gigantic service area, and just to highlight it, as he mentioned at the beginning, it's larger than the state of Delaware. So it's an enormous area that takes 2 hours to drive from one side to the other, which is required all sorts of remote sensing and practices that have now turned out to be super important under the current situation. Let me switch to you, Todd. You're also in a heavy hurricane area, have had tremendous experience preparing and responding to emergencies. How have you and your utility seen this so far? How are your personnel doing?
I think they're actually doing really well, and we're happy to report we also haven't had any positive COVID detections. We do have at least one employee that we're waiting on results back, and we've had as many as about 20 employees that we have asked to self-quarantine out of an abundance of precaution. And definitely working with our employees is at the center of our response efforts. But some of that has been enabled by the things that we did have in place. And it's always great to participate on panels and discussions like this, because as I hear Bruce talk, it's, even though we're across the country from each other, or certainly, across quite a bit of distance, the stories are very similar. We have 21 different plants that we operate because our utility has been formed through growth and acquisition of some small utilities that were previously existed. And so because of those same challenges, we were also very automated, and that's helped us reduce operator coverage over time. But we are able to see all of our plants remotely and through our SCADA systems and achieve the vast majority of the controls that we need to. And so that has definitely helped with our adaptability from controlling plants. But likewise, we had very robust IT systems in place as well that allowed us to very quickly move to work from home scenarios. We started moving our high-risk employees to home all the way back on March 16th. And within about 2 weeks, had the vast majority of our employees that were able to work from home working there. And that's somewhere just under about half of our total workforce. And in the last 2 weeks, we've actually managed to get almost all of even our call center that are doing their work from home as well. So that has been a big step. And then the other piece is that we've implemented this, as Bruce mentioned, the standard CDC recommendations, a lot of the shifts in work schedules, both in staggered start times to minimize the number of people at any given location, varying our reporting locations. We have some central maintenance facilities where employees had traditionally reported, and we've got those reporting to multiple areas. One of the philosophies we've done with that is paying particular attention to any given work function to make sure that we're paying attention to not only the numbers of people, but to pay very close attention to the functions so that if we do happen to have someone come down with an illness, it's not spreading across an entire function right away. And so all of those have come into play, but the number one thing that I'll probably emphasize throughout this whole discussion is listening to our employees, because they are the ones that are on the front lines and they're seeing these issues. And it's just amazing the number of interactions that you figure out that you have on a normal daily basis. And so we're seeing just many additional work processes, such as interfaces with our contractors that are doing development and construction out in the field and adapting some of those processes electronically that had traditionally been paper. And listening to the employees has been a key part of that so that we can understand what they're seeing and adapt to those changes to make sure that they're safe. And we're continuing to work with really two things in mind: the safety of our employees in the community and maintaining continuity of service throughout this response effort.
That was fantastic, Todd. And by the way, when Todd says they have a big system, very much like Hampton Roads had the size of Delaware, Todd and his team managed 3,000 miles of pipeline, which is sort of a staggering number. So both of these systems are very large and over a spread out period. Todd, actually, Andy, I have a question now that you've heard. When you were at Camden County Municipal Utility Authority, to what extent did the continuity and emergency response plans that you'd have in place cover an event like this? Is this were the steps you would have used if it was a snow or a hurricane event? How relevant are they, and would they have been to a moment like this?
Well, thanks, George. And first of all, let me commend both Bruce and Todd for their description of what they're doing. And I know Bruce's CEO, general manager at Hampton Roads, Ted Henderson, is one of the best leaders in our water sector. And both of these utilities are doing terrific jobs. I think that on the one hand, much of it would have been the same. For example, dealing with, say, Hurricane Sandy in 2012 in New Jersey. But I think the biggest difference that we're all facing, and I would see if Bruce and Todd agree with this, is the duration. I mean, the thing is that even in the case of a hurricane or any some sort of unanticipated failure, and you're not dealing with it for so many days and weeks, and also the fact that your manpower itself, the thing that you need the most, is what is vulnerable in addition to the equipment. So I think that it is certainly an adaptation of what one would do in an emergency response plan. But I think because of the duration and the direct risk to the both the employees and the public, I think we're dealing with something that is unprecedented as well.
That's a tremendous insight, Andy. It is the duration in this case. When I was at DC Water, we had snowpocalypse and a variety of extreme weather events in particular, but nothing that lasted. We're maybe 2 weeks to a month in, but could be another months of using some of these practices before we come up to where we can go to something nearer to normal, and maybe longer than that. Todd, I want to pick up on one comment that you made, is when you say I love that, though, the number one priority is that listening to your employees, and allows you to keep them and your customers safe and maintain continuity of operations. Have you adopted any special techniques to interact with your employees, given that they're more dispersed now and less at work, just to make sure that you are getting that kind of feedback?
Yeah, that's definitely been a significant part of our efforts. We have some tools that we already had in place, and some of it just is adapting how we use the existing tools. So every one of us uses email every day, but we've adapted how we use email. Some of the examples that we're using with our employees is we're having daily meetings with our leadership team just to make sure that everybody's up to speed on a routine basis. But we've gone to extensive use of WebEx and other remote conferencing tools. we find that that even though we're not in personal contact, that personal voice contact is still important. And so we have implemented a series of calls as well. We just had one this morning with our supervisors that we're doing about every 2 weeks. But we're even doing calls with our entire workforce. So we call them Toho all calls. And we've done one already, and we have one scheduled for next week. And we had about 180 employees participate. And part of our efforts with that were to reach out via SurveyMonkey ahead of time to take their questions. And so that when we have those calls, we of course walk through the things that we as leadership want to convey, but we've also made sure that we hit on their top questions as well, and then continue to open that up for open discussion with our employees. Because maintaining that transparency has been really helpful, so that they know what we know, and equally as important as what we don't know. And then we've also augmented some of our employee newsletters to use those to tell the personal side of things that are going on, because that's one of the biggest things that we, because of the duration of this event and the magnitude of this event reaching all areas of the world, this isn't just responding to something that's happened locally. People have personal issues that they may have family members that are sick, or I've had a couple of employees that have told me that they've had friends that have died in other areas of the country or the world. And so that's a whole new dimension that we're trying to make sure we touch on, and we're using our newsletter and things of that nature to make sure we cover that piece as well.
Thank you, Todd. By the way, you were sent me one of the newsletters you sent out, which again is one of the more impressive documents I've seen in response to this event. But one thing I'll just brag on that I really liked that you did is sending so many employees to work at home. You created a program to, I'm not sure if the right word is auction, but to sort of to use some of your older, it's not that old as we know in the IT world, but equipment that you could distribute to your staff from your inventory to make sure that they were able to connect from home. And I thought that was a really great step, because some of your employees may have less capability of doing that than others. And that was a very tangible step that you took to support this additional communication. And I'll also say about Todd that when he sent me information, at the top of the list was communicating with the team and how they were interacting to make sure everyone understood, including these questions that really are personal, and how different this is and how it's affecting not only the safety of your team, but the morale. Switching back to you, Bruce, you mentioned you have 45 people in the engineering office, all but 2 of whom are now working remotely. Any highlights or pointers about how that's been working, or for others at HRSD that might be helpful to other utilities that are embarking on having more and more of their employees work remotely? It's something. What do you think is working best?
Well, we've gotten very efficient using both Zoom and Skype to share information and just kind of make that face-to-face contact. You know, people are working at home, they feel isolated. You know, they're getting used to working in an environment. Maybe they don't have an office set up yet. Maybe they're got loved ones that are home, or other challenges. I think, you know, we just have to be flexible. They have health daycare issues and kids they're dealing with. So everybody's got new challenges, and we're all kind of in this together. So we're really trying to, you know, just be flexible with our staff, work with them on their work hours when we can. They've got a maybe husband and wife they have to take turns taking care of the kids. They're teaching them a lot of different things that are coming up. So being as flexible as we possibly can with our staff has been huge. We've just gone through an IT upgrade, going to Surface Pros for the entire organization, and that's showed great dividends because we've got the latest computers that we've been able to take home with us. And we've been very flexible with staff. If you need to take your chair from work, you need to take a second screen, whatever you need to do to be efficient with your work. We've pretty much just allowed folks to find the best way for them to get their work done. And most of our work is done through consultants and contractors, so we've done the same with them. We were trying to let contractors work. One thing we found out is they've reached out to us and says, hey, our people want to work. And they're trying to find ways to follow CDC guidelines in the field. And if they can do that, we'd like to see those projects continue, and those folks really want to keep those paychecks coming. Our consultants are able to work remotely, you know, very effectively and efficiently. They do that often anyway. So they were able to make that jump pretty quick. Our contractors are making that adjustment to make sure that they practice all the best practices on these construction sites, which can be a huge challenge for us. But we're working with folks, trying to find ways to make it all happen. We've got all the PPE that you might need for employees and for our folks that are frontline folks. So, and you know, worry and fear is a hard thing, and the best way you can handle that, and Todd's kind of hit on that a bit, is to listen and understand what their issues are, because everybody's got different issues. Everybody hears different things from the news, so everybody has a kind of a different worry, a different fear, and just being understanding to that and being flexible and adaptable is significant for us.
Gosh, I love that, Bruce, and all the conversation and discussion I hear about interaction with employees, gaining feedback, being sensitive, adapting. All of those are highlights to me of high functioning, not just utilities, but high functioning organizations of any kind. I want to switch over to something that I know is still happening, which is backups in sewer systems, water main breaks out on the system. And Andy, I want to ask you first that what's your sense of how a utility responds when there is a situation that requires on-site work, and then get a flavor from Bruce and Todd as how it's working at their utilities. When there's a water main break, or there's sewer backup, or some of these so-called flushable wipes cause a problem at a pump station. What's your sense, Andy, of how a utility generally is handling these kinds of situations?
Well, I think that like both Bruce and Todd have said, and as you knew when you were the head of DC Water, or when I was at CCMUA, that the water and sewer service has to continue no matter what. So the water utilities and wastewater utilities are going ahead, and even with limited manpower, taking care of things. I guess in some instances, depending on the issue, they may have to bring more people in for the reserve people that they've kept safely. But that's the whole idea about flattening the curve, is making sure that you do have your people not only safe, but in reserve and available in case the need is there. And I think in some instances, it may be that, that's where your emergency contractor comes in. If you either lack the manpower or you need to preserve, you're so limited that you need to preserve and keep your people in reserve, then you may need to call on supplemental, forces. That's why it's important to keep your emergency chains available as well. But the bottom line is that the show must go on, and that's the story for wastewater and drinking water 24/7, 365 days a year. One thing I thought that was kind of interesting is some utilities are taking advantage of the less traffic on the road and actually doing some proactive work. I would say that that's probably, I don't know if I would agree with that. I think it's probably better to keep the social distancing and reduce the risk and look at the long game. But I know that some entities are actually taking advantage of the lower traffic patterns and getting some work done. But at any rate, there's no doubt that water and wastewater utilities are continuing to do whatever they need to do to react to emergencies. Another important thing, though, for the long run is that redundancy is so critical to making sure that your maintenance project is not an emergency repair, but just a normal repair. So one of the things when we talk about what happens in the future, we'll be talking about is redundancy and maximizing a utility's resiliency.
Thank you, Andy. Let me turn it back to Bruce first. How is Hampton Roads responding when you do have a call out? And maybe to provide context, have you changed any of your maintenance procedures, reducing some of your standard maintenance and limiting or focusing as a response? And when something does happen, any special steps that you're taking in Hampton Roads?
So interesting. We had, unfortunately, we had a sewer force main break earlier in the week. So we're addressing the issue that Andy just brought up. We were working with our operations department and a local emergency contractor that we have in place. We were able to get that repair made in a relatively short period of time. And the fact that it was in the public right of way. So, and the fact that there's relatively few cars on the road, that's helped us to limit the maintenance of traffic issues and the impacts to the citizens as we made that repair. And then on a kind of a similar note, we have a very large pipeline project and a fairly busy corridor, and all the project was scheduled to be done at night. But with the reduced traffic, we've been able to convince a local city to allow us to work during daytime hours, which will help us get the project done faster and with less risk to the contractor, less safety issues than working late at night. So that's actually a slight silver lining to this otherwise rather unattractive issues we're facing right now. So I think we've done some folks with our operations department to stagger work hours and to make sure we just don't have everybody in the same place at the same time in case we do have a positive hit for the COVID-19 virus. But we're pretty much going as we have planned, as we've done our work, and as we will continue to do our work. We're, practicing, washing the hands and doing all the CDC best practices. But generally, I think we're doing what we've been required to do, and we're getting folks to come to work and make sure that they're ready to go.
Thank you, Bruce. I want to highlight how you both have emphasized the imperative of our industry, which is no matter what the challenge or risk, is that we need this service to continue. And the challenges don't stop, given that there's a coronavirus. Bruce, how are you? Todd, how are you seeing these issues down in Florida?
I think very similarly. Certainly, the emergency response and breaks and those kinds of things. It's we kind of opened up the conversation with today talking about employees and how dedicated they are, and we see exactly that they rise to the call and they go take care of things. We are certainly trying to adapt it if we can do those response efforts with less staff, or in the case of sewer breaks or places where there could be aerosol sewage, because we don't fully understand all of the implications of this virus, deploying N95 masks in those response actions so that employees have those tools available to help keep themselves safe. And then when it moves over to more routine work, it's really, Bruce used the word flexible, and I think that's the key. We've got some areas where we feel like we can do those safely, and we're continuing with our normal maintenance activities. We've got a few other areas on our plants where we've got less redundancy in some of our workforce, and we are shedding some of our more routine maintenance activities because it's not just worth the exposure risk that could impact operations on down the road.
Fascinating, and I'm hearing elements of all of what you're saying in interactions I've had. There is some work that can go on a little easier now, given traffic conditions. Although there is the questions of, is there's work that does not need to be done. Maybe it should be deferred just so that employees can be held in reserve and are available for work that must be done. Knowing that some of that work that we're deferring will, if we don't get to it at some point, will have a consequence. But let me switch over, which I heard from both of you, and I know this was significant for Andy, is the ability to monitor and understand what's going on in your system when you don't have as many people on site or at the operation. It sounds like, I'll start with you, Bruce, because it sounds like given the sheer size of your system, you were automating and using remote sensing techniques, not because of the coronavirus, but just because of the sheer scale of what you do your work, and you can't have employees everywhere all at once. But what are some of the steps that you took that have been most beneficial, as it turns out, now that COVID-19 is the challenge we face?
So we're about 80% of our sewer system is pressurized. So we have significant capabilities to measure flow. We have about over 300 flow meters in our interceptor sewer system, many pressure gauges and rain gauges, and all that information is shared back in our main office, and then we share that information throughout the organization. So we've been doing that to address SSO issues in our region. So it's been very helpful. We have all sorts of diagnostic tools set up to measure peak flows, pressure spikes, other things, and we can get that information out very quickly to our operations folks if there's an operational problem. So we have some pretty powerful tools, and in a sewer force main system, of course, you have some capabilities to hold flows, divert flows, and do different things if we do have problems. So we're really organized that way. We're in the middle of implementing a smart sewer system, and that's going to allow us to do a lot more as we get information about rain, and we can divert flow to a different service area, possibly to a different treatment plant. We have a lot. We're building more and more equalization tanks, which would allow us more flexibility too. So we've done a lot in the years to give ourselves a lot of capabilities remotely. All of our treatment plants have distributed control systems, very powerful tools that we can use to make smart decisions with our facilities. And moving forward, we're just trying to optimize that further. Looking to go to a remoteless treatment plant facility one day. That's in the cards. State regulators have a role to play in that decision, but we're looking to make that a future option to best operate those facilities.
This was always one of my favorite aspects of your operation down there, Bruce, was how advanced you were or are in these digital, for lack of a better single word, or maybe smart water techniques. Let me ask you a quick follow-up, though. Are there any of these kinds of practices that you're accelerating their adoption in the next weeks or month because you might need a little more, or you're in pretty good shape now? That'd be my first. The second quick follow-up, and I'll ask the same of these to Todd, is if a utility is earlier on in the adoption curve of these kinds of techniques, and you had to make a one recommendation or two as to what a utility can do, if they are needed to quickly adopt, where you'd suggest they start. And Andy, after Bruce and Todd, I'm going to ask you the same. So starting with you, Bruce.
So these technology projects are driven by technology, and they're tough to do quickly. But if you don't do them quickly, the technology will leapfrog past you. So it's a challenge to make right decisions, and then to get that data back in a fast way to be able to make decisions is critical too. So you need to be very thoughtful about not only getting that data, but how you're going to get it back and make decisions. So we use a number of different tools. So we use a program called Pi, which allows us to get information out and to present information in ways that are easy for our various folks within the organization to make sense out of it. We have lots of weather data that's connected with our Pi system, which allows us to see during a hurricane exactly what's going on, where the rain's coming down. So I'm not sure there's a lot you can do in the very short run, but planning for the long run is really your best bet, and being smart with the technology and being able to get that data back in a timely fashion, whether you're using 4G or 5G technology, wide area networks, different technologies are really important when you make those decisions so that you can get that data back in a timely fashion.
Fantastic. And what I learned at DC Water is having the data was the first question, getting it to the right people was the second, and then putting in a format that allowed them to make decisions was the final and perhaps most important key. Todd, let me turn it to you. How are you finding that sort of the remote sensing automation techniques are helping you in this effort? If you were advising one of your brethren about what they might be able to do, where would you think they should start? And for you, is there anything you're accelerating at this point to try to do a little bit more because of the potential duration of this crisis? I know that's a lot of questions all at once. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, let me see if I can keep track of them all. We similar to Bruce, we are extensively pumped wastewater system. So we have over 400 pump stations in our network, and those are all controlled and visible by SCADA remotely. And candidly, similar as well to Bruce, that's to help give us quick response to minimize SSOs and to know how those stations are operating. Similarly, in the plants, particularly on the water, many of our water plants are very limited visits on just a periodic basis. And so we monitor all those plants remotely, control. It's an entire integrated system. And on the water reclamation facilities as well, we do have our smaller facilities that they're not 24-hour, but they are monitored back at our main plant on a continuous basis. So all of those things are already in place and certainly paying dividends during our response to this crisis. As far as our acceleration, No, I really don't see a whole lot that we didn't have either underway and that we were establishing as our priorities that this is driving us to change. I think but that's not to say that there's not some things that we'll learn from this. Some of the remote work, I think we've found some employees that didn't think they would work remotely, that it's working out well, and that I expect we'll see more hybrid solutions where people might work from home part-time just so they can get a little more quiet time. And so some of those types of changes, I think, will live past our response to this crisis. As far as other utilities, the piece that I would advise is to really think like a business. We certainly, our decisions and the criteria for our decisions, it's not pure profit driven like a business would be. But we have our priorities that we establish, and we do need to think in terms of how businesses operate and what we as individual organizations have as resource capacity and what value we're trying to derive from these improvements. I do see sometimes that technology solutions that are implemented that may not offer value. So my recommendation is these decisions are very unique to each utility. It's important to understand what's out there. It's important to understand what problem you're trying to solve in your utility and where you are able to derive notable value by deploying technology solutions to pick what route is right for you, and then that your utility is capable of deploying those solutions.
Todd, that was chapter and verse of tremendous wisdom on adoption of technology at a utility. So I hope those of you listening were taking notes. That was fantastic. Andy, let me turn it to you, because I know we at Moonshot Missions have been thinking about some of our utilities in underserved communities. They are incredible people working incredibly hard, often understaffed, don't have revenue challenges because the communities they're in have economic challenges as well. And we've been thinking on some of the things that a utility could do if they needed to adopt some sensing and automation projects quickly, recognizing that that's never easy. Any thoughts that you have on that front, Andy?
I do. Thanks, George. And I think I would echo what Todd said about adopting the private sector approach. I think the key for a public sector entity is to adopt the private sector approach toward efficiency, but then harness that toward the public good. That's the way the community is getting the best of both worlds, both the optimal efficiency, but also, the fact that we don't operate for profit, but we operate for the public good. So I think the best utilities in the sector are doing just that. So I think that the watchword for the future the watchwords are going to be automation, resiliency, and redundancy. I think that whether a lot of water utilities were concerned about the silver tsunami, the notion that 50% of the water workforce is eligible for retirement within the next 3 to 5 years. So we were already thinking about manpower shortages and what to do with that. So I think the thing is utilities need to build their staffing resiliency by making sure that we're recruiting, and ideally recruiting from our communities, so that we have a workforce that reflects the communities that we serve, but also making sure that there's better cross training, more versatility among the workforce, so that we're more prepared for this sort of thing should it recur, whether it be a long duration type of thing like the coronavirus, or a hurricane, or some kind of weather event, or just a shortage due to lack of personnel. I think there's that. I think on the equipment side, we need to make our equipment more versatile as well with respect to automation, with putting cameras in critical control areas, so that people can actually view the work remotely, and I think that will make a big difference. Obviously, we wouldn't want to allow people to do too much operational change remotely, because there's the danger of hacking and cyber terrorism, but at least virtual viewing, so that they don't necessarily have to be on site. And I think redundancy is really key too. If a utility, which we've talked a lot about flattening the curve with respect to employees, We also want to flatten the curve with respect to, reactive and emergency maintenance. If you can have sufficient redundancy and a good asset management program, such that you're not dealing with emergencies when you least can afford to, such as a situation like this, then you'll obviously improve your utility's capability to respond to such an emergency.
Again, chapter and verse, Andy. Thank you for that. Let me hone in on when you said installing cameras, because my reaction is exactly parallel to all of you, Bruce, Todd, and Andy. That technology is difficult to adapt under any circumstances, and particularly difficult to do quickly, because you want to have it collected in a way that's meaningful, useful to your employees. There's training and all the steps, so that it's not one of these new technologies that we all know about in our own homes that I don't know how to use. So, because of all the challenges that come with new technology. On the other hand, given the duration of this virus, it could be months, could come in waves. We at least need to be prepared for extended periods of lower staffing, staggered, all the practice you're talking about. I was thinking of the ways and the steps that a utility would take if they did have to move more quickly, like identifying if one of their challenges is overflows and backups in the collection system in particular places, maybe not a full adoption of level and flow sensors, but taking the areas of greatest historic challenge and putting sensors in particular places just so you could reduce the need to mobilize trucks except when you know they're needed. The potential of Andy and you and I have talked about this is, could you deploy cameras at some of the places in your system that you could monitor remotely, maybe with fairly simple technology, almost like what our kids use for all sorts of things. Just quick thoughts on the three of you, then I want to move on to finances, because I think that all of us worry about what the consequence is in the longer term, given the economic thoughts. But as just quick sort of lightning question, is there anything simple and quick that a utility might do on any of the topics or others that I've raised? And then we'll move on. And Andy, I'll go backwards and I'll start with you.
Okay, thanks, George. Well, I think you've hit on an important opportunity. I mean, first of all, I would say making sure that all of your enunciators are working properly, that your remote systems are working and with backups in place and tested, so that you are getting information quickly. And then I think you would identify the critical control areas in your treatment plant, manned areas, that you would still be able to have a camera on a critical level sensor, a critical area, so that the person could monitor remotely and then notify people who are on site, so that therefore you could, again, flatten your curve and spread out your workers.
Thank you, Andy. Bruce.
So I'd say there, you've got to look at what's the most critical location in your system. There's a number of them, but you have to kind of prioritize those using a risk-based kind of decision-making process. But, I'd say at the end of the day, by doing this, you're going to get a lot of data, and you really have to make sense out of that data, and using different tools that we have in-house to be able to make some sense out of that data and be able to make decisions. So you have to be able to get you'll be getting a lot of data, pressure, flow, lots of other information, and you've got to be able to have people that can make sense out of it at 2 a.m. when there's a storm or some other type of event. So having tools in place, some automated processes that allow you to say, if the pressure is above this or below that, you send out a note, a text, an email, so that you don't overwhelm people with information, so they don't figure out that there was a problem 7 days later because they're just looking at so much data. So being smart, using that data in a way that makes sense, and having good people to look at that information is key.
Fantastic advice, Bruce. Todd.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree. It absolutely starts with understanding where your exposure points are and those that are critical, that you need that information. I think there's always all levels of sophistication, from collecting, the difference between collecting level data and getting a point on what the actual level is versus just an alarm if it's above a certain set point, or the same on pressures. And yeah, there are simplistic systems out there that that are cell phone based and that can call a cell phone and don't require integration with a more complicated system that you can do pressure or level and with some trigger points to just call people out if you have a problem. And so I do think there are some simple ways to move forward with those types of systems. And again, it's understanding what your capabilities are and prioritizing those areas that you consider yourself to have exposure in.
That's a hopeful message, Todd. I appreciate that. Let me switch over to finances. We are getting reports already that two main sources for many utilities for revenue. Sometimes revenue comes in through the city, and cities are seeing, or the municipal jurisdiction, whether county or at the local level, and that revenues are way down based on how the economy has changed. And on one hand, and the other is just straight customer revenue, that so much economic loss, restaurants, hotels, office buildings are using so much less water that we're seeing significant reductions to revenue. And then the third category, which is an important one on purpose, but if there are people out there who have lost their jobs and are not able to cover all their bills, one that they are likely not paying is water, because we've all made the appropriate commitment to continue water service in face of these challenges, because we don't want to cut anyone off of water that they need to wash their hands and all the rest to flatten the curve. So the long and short of that is that I think we're all, as utilities, trying to prepare for a period of time that may be extended with lower revenues. And I'll start, Todd. Are you seeing that at all yet? And are you adopting anything in particular to try to prepare for the revenue challenges that are either here or are to come? And then I'll go to Bruce and Andy.
Yes. So we have not seen the revenue changes yet, because it just based upon billing cycles and lagging billing cycles. But we know it's there, and we've seen that through just our flows. Being here in Central Florida, we're a very tourist-dependent economy, and with all of our theme parks shut down, we have certainly seen that decline in tourism. In fact, our westernmost plant that's out near the attractions area, our flows are off 50% already. And so we do know that will translate into revenue impacts. And they're for us, they're twofold. We're a standalone entity, so we survive off of our rates, and that is where our focus is. We're looking at that from both the residential and the commercial side. Residential, because everyone's is at home. We're seeing flows that are either stable or even slightly up. And with that, we expect our revenue challenges to be mostly where we've got people that have lost jobs or have income challenges and the challenges of paying those bills. On the commercial side, we've got that piece where there's businesses that will be challenged due to their losses of income, but then there's also just the overall loss of revenue due to flow reduction and not being in operations. We're very fortunate in that we have positioned ourselves in a very healthy financial situation. And so that we're a AAA rated utility and have been building cash reserves for future alternative water supply projects, as well as just being very thoughtful on our expenditures. And so at this point, it really depends for us on how long this lasts. Right now, we have not suspended major initiatives. We're in the middle of master planning. We're in the middle of some of our, we've just launched an $80 million WIFIA program. That funding is already restricted and set aside, and that'll be continuing. We are being cautious on new program launches, and we'll continue to monitor what this revenue hits looks like. And we've structured this in really a short, mid, and long range approach. In the short term, it's monitoring and just not doing any major changes. And that short term for us is a 0 to 60 day window. Out past 60 to 180 days, we'll continue to monitor. By that point, we expect the revenue picture to solidify a little better. And that's where we'll start to take a look at and likely to be in additional operating cost reductions, and we may see some project impacts that we just need to delay projects, most likely in more of the support function, some of our IT projects and things of that nature. As we get out past 180 days, that's where we'll start to understand better what the recovery looks like, whether we've had significant growth impacts, and what our impacts would look like in growth-related projects and things of that nature. We do also know our customers are suffering. Like many other utilities, we've suspended disconnects. We've also suspended late fees. We anticipate coming out of this, as we get back to work and the economy starts to come back and businesses reopen, we'll be deploying extended payment plan options for employees. And our board just on Wednesday also did double our customer assistance program, adding, it was originally at $50,000. We've upped that to $100,000. We'll continue to monitor that for our lower income customers that are having challenges paying bills. You outline almost what we're hearing across the board, which is many utilities that have mostly a suburban residential base have, in some cases, seen even higher use because everybody's home. Those utilities that have main commercial bases are more challenged. And then, of course, large utilities like yours that sweep across both see a puts and takes, some areas with more, some with less. But enormously appreciate your description of what you're doing on behalf of your customers, and that you're preparing. And if there's a lower revenue, you'll be ready for it, and the kinds of projects you might delay or defer. Bruce, how are you seeing this in Hampton Roads?
I would say we have many of the very same issues that Todd highlighted. We serve Colonial Williamsburg and Virginia Beach oceanfront, so two tourist areas. So it's a big challenge for us. Our HRSD is in a strong financial position, which allows us to make good decisions in a time like this. So I'd say we're able to really, when we bill our customers directly, so we understand all those challenges. Our customer service folks are very busy taking those calls and dealing with folks, and being reasonable with folks is one of the things that we're definitely focused on. And I'd say many of the issues that Todd talked about, we're following too. We have a very aggressive, as I said before, a very aggressive capital improvement program, which is driving our rates to go up. And we've decided to delay a rate increase this year. Just didn't feel good about July 1st putting in a new rate increase with folks struggling right now. So we've put a rate increase off for at least a year until the dust settles with the COVID-19 situation. So we're dealing with all these financial issues. We were in strong shape. We've got some good folks in our finance department that are looking at lots of different options, whether it's working with federal government, state government to get additional loans to allow our projects to move forward. I was nervous. We've bid a couple of projects recently, and I'm worried that maybe there'd be fewer bidders, or greatly increased prices due to supply chain concerns. But we're actually seeing some fairly aggressive pricing from the contracting community at the moment. I think they're worried about backlog, and there have been some projects that are delayed from some of the other cities and counties in our region. So I think it's actually probably a good time to bid work at the moment. Contractors are looking to get that increased backlog and to know that they can keep their folks busy in the near term. So I would say we've only bid one or two projects since the coronavirus has hit, but our early read is that folks are giving pretty aggressive pricing, and they want to work and they want to get new work. So just a word to the wise with that.
Fascinating, and that doesn't surprise me. I have heard that there is some work being delayed and deferred for the reasons you've all stated, but that means the work that is going forward is all the more important to the contracting community. And I think you're probably right that depending on supply chain, the pricing, I'm not surprised, has been good. Andy, part of your service area when you were at Camden County was Camden City, which is a city with tremendous challenges on the economic and front. How do you think Camden, this on a financial basis, will be affected? Your past utility, and what do you think the kind of steps that will be taken on that financial front?
Well, I think that, thanks, George. I think that the most important thing, to deal with this current crisis is the fact that there's going to be a revenue shortfall for the reasons that you and Bruce and Todd have described. And I really believe, and I've felt this even before the virus, that it's important that there be a federal program like LIHEAT for heating, a low-income assistance for water service as well. I mean, drinking water and wastewater services are absolutely critical to life. You coined the phrase "water is life" while you're at DC Water, George, and it's absolutely true. And if people don't have water service or wastewater service, they can't live in the home anymore. So the actual viability of a family depends on water service. And so I think that I really feel very strongly. I know NACWA and WEF have been and others have been advocating for a low-income program. If such a program was implemented at this time, it would make up for the revenue shortfalls that much of the revenue shortfalls the utilities will see. I think that's a big step forward. I think, though, in the absence of that, you mentioned that Camden City is a very economically stressed community. That's right. The mean average household income in Camden City is $26,000, and many, very high percentage of people last year, before all this hit, were in below the poverty line, and nearly 10% unemployment then, which was very high compared to the national average, and that's going to be significantly worse with this current situation. What my utility adopted was a twofold program to avoid raising rates, and I know you alluded to that at the beginning of the program, George. By optimizing efficiency, by implementing an ISO 14001 efficiency program, we were able to significantly lower our costs, and then also using the state revolving fund program to fund nearly all of our projects at very low interest rates. So therefore, the low annual debt service was actually lower than the operational savings from the improvements. So by doing those things, we were able to forestall rate increases. In fact, our utility only raised our rates 4% total in 24 years, 4% total. So when you count inflation, that was like a 40% reduction in rates. So I think that that's always an important thing for utilities to do. But now with these revenue shortfalls, and with the fact that it'll be harder for utilities, our customers to pay, it's more important than ever that we optimize our cost efficiencies and also look for low-cost financing.
I love that, Andy, and taking the steps that will allow lower cost operations long into the future now certainly make a lot of sense. We're running near to the end. I do want to ask Bruce about one thing in particular that I know Hampton Roads is doing. I've heard, and it's been mentioned on this call, I think, Todd, you may have mentioned it, maybe Bruce as well, of worries about the risk of coronavirus exposure in the collection system and in the treatment plant itself on the sewer side. And of course, our employees wear protective equipment already, because they're already, even before coronavirus, there were elements in sewage that we wouldn't want our employees to be contaminated by. But I know Hampton Roads is doing some very interesting research on coronavirus in the collection system. And Bruce, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Gladly. Our water quality department is kind of leading the way. We have folks that have really been focused on source tracking and using DNA to understand the source of pollution in the waterways of Hampton Roads, to be able to use that to backtrack up the tributaries to find out if we have a sewer line problem, or whether it's geese or pet waste or whatever. So we have folks that are capable of dealing with that issue. So we're able to also apply that to viruses in the wastewater itself. The EPA and the CDC have discussed the issue of wastewater and coronavirus. And as long as we're using proper PPE, our folks should be generally safe. But we are able to track viruses like the coronavirus and SARS and other things in the wastewater, and determine not actually if there's a health issue, but determine the levels of these viruses in the wastewater. And you can actually see if a population, you might be ahead of the curve a bit to know that the population is seeing more cases of coronavirus in your service area, or less if the cases are starting to go down with time. So we're able to start to look at that information, and we're hope to be able to share that not to make real-term decisions, short-term decisions, but to be able to share that and to be able to use that as maybe a catalyst in the future.
What I love about that, Bruce, is that and it's fascinating that one of the early warning systems for the potential risk to any particular geographic area one of the first indicators might be something that you would be able to collect in the sewer system that would allow then other public health authorities to take appropriate steps in various communities identified through the collection system. I find that fascinating. We're right to the end. I wanted to give some final questions to this tremendous group, and I have taken pages and pages of notes myself and have learned quite a bit. So you do me honor and the sector honor by your contributions today. But I want to give each of you the chance for final thoughts on either of these two questions or both. Any final suggestions for the men and women doing this work who are listening in about what we could be doing? Or second, what should we be doing in this current crisis that can really help us prepare for what's coming next? And I know each one we could spend an hour on. So this is sort of a lightning final round to the audience who've been with us today. And let me say again, it's been a pleasure to be part of the program. But let me start. I'll just go straight down the line. Let me start with you, Andy.
Thanks, George. Well, I think my message to water workers would be to know that your work is really important, and more important than you may ever know. You're protecting the public health of the people that you serve. You're protecting the waterways, and that is true all the time, every day, but never more so than at a time like this. For utility managers like Bruce and Todd and George, you and I, we used to be, and for all of our brethren out there and sisters in the water sector, if this is an opportunity to once again reemphasize the importance of our sector to the public health and to the environment. And I think that I see this as an opportunity to improve our resiliency against all sorts of issues, because this has tested our sector's resiliency in a way that nothing else has before, as we discussed earlier. And I think that it is really important for policymakers and elected officials to realize that we must invest in our infrastructure, we must invest in redundancy, resiliency, automation, and in our personnel.
Thank you, Andy. Uplifting as always. Bruce.
So just a couple of quick final points here. One of the things that I didn't realize when we started down this process, one of our challenges we've seen is one of the challenges we always have on a capital project, is acquiring easements and acquiring property that we might need. And we're finding that many of the city and county courthouses in the region are not able to allow us to acquire those easements, and they're still working in a paper environment. So and negotiating with property owners, doing that in person can be a big challenge too. So that's something that we really hadn't thought of, but I'd suggest that folks think about that as they go through these issues going forward. We also have thought about the issue of what happens if we have a positive case of coronavirus and we have to quarantine a work center. So we've reached out to about 30 of our recent retirees and asked them to see if they'd be willing to come back to help us in a pinch. So we're trying to build that database of folks that can step in and fill in a gap in case we have to send a bunch of folks home due to a potential quarantine. And then finally, I would just say we need to, and I'm reminded of this, but this situation brings it to heart, that we really have to have really great gratitude for our industry. We're doing important things, and we really need to communicate thanks and remind staff of how important their job is.
Thank you, Bruce. Fantastic thoughts. Todd, you're batting cleanup.
Okay. I want to just start with, again, that personnel and the people of our sector piece. There's just, it really is amazing how people set their own priorities aside for the good of the community. And we just have a fabulous sector, and the people that work, whether it's in support roles or out in the field or in every aspect of our business, are just phenomenal public servants. And that's what really makes the positive outcomes that we see come to fruition. I heard about one of the comments that was made. It was about infrastructure support, and I think that is critical. We've got to continue to make sure that at a local, state, and national level that the importance of infrastructure and the water sector is understood, and that we invest in it at all of those levels. There's some of the additional stimulus packages are discussing water assistance, and I'm very hopeful that those go through, because there is no sector that's any more critical than ours when it comes to national infrastructure. And the last is just, again, calls like this and the information sharing between utilities is vital. And I think when we're dealing with a situation like we are here, where there's a lot of unknowns and it's a fast pace, it really does emphasize the value of organizations like WEF and utilities and these professional organizations, where we can share information and learn from each other, and do so quickly so that we can react to what is an ever-changing environment. So I really appreciate everyone for putting this together as well. It's been great participating on it.
Thank you, Todd. That was a perfect way to conclude a fantastic program. For myself, this is George Hawkins, and I just want to offer my incredible gratitude to the panelists today for WEF. This is just one of so many things that WEF is doing to help our industry and all the people we serve at this moment of crisis. But of course, they do that year round. So take a look at all the other resources that WEF has, other webinars like this one, and written materials. They're invaluable as we all move forward. And to those of you who have joined us today or listening in when you can, and our blessings to you. It's hard to overstate the value of what you do. And gosh, just in my humble view, water is the foundation of civilization, and you're the ones holding the line, even when we face an unprecedented pandemic. So thank you, gentlemen, for the incredible insights today. Thank you, WEF, for sponsoring us, and we look forward to more in the future. Thanks, everybody.